All right, we'll begin here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jamie Mara, and I'm Director of Strategic Communications for Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative. As noted in the advisory, we have 3 people here today to announce milk pricing reform priorities for the cooperative. The journalists on the call, you should have received an embargo press release at about noon Central Standard Time. We appreciate your adherence to the embargo of 2:15 this afternoon. The release is going to be distributed to other media at about 3:30. You will be on that distribution as well, but it'll be a duplicate for you. We also plan to provide a link to a recording of the press conference as soon as it's prepared, hopefully shortly. Before we start, I want to provide a bit of background about the cooperative. So Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, based in Wisconsin, provides milk testing verification services and federal policy advocacy for dairy farmers in 9 states in the upper Midwest. Those farmers ship to more than 30 private processors across the region. And we are the 3rd largest dairy co-op in the United States based on milk volume. Let me review just a few logistics here. First, I would ask that everyone please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras until the question and answer portion. So thank you for that. We will start by hearing from each of our spokespeople who will provide background, context, and details about our proposal. And then we will open things up for questions, and you'll have three different options for doing so. You can type the question directly into the chat box. You can click on the hand icon along the top of the window and we will call on you. And for those of you just joining us by phone, I will ask for questions from others after some of the other reporters that are connected by video have a chance to ask. We'll do our best to address everybody's question, probably in the order that they come in. And then lastly, our spokespeople will be available for one-on-one interviews after the press conference. You please arrange those with me. You have my information on the advisory, and you should see it in the chat box. It will also be, it was also on the press release. So I think we are ready to get started. I want to introduce Tim Trotter, CEO of Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, for his remarks. And then you'll hear from Mitch Davis of Davis Family Dairies in Minnesota, who is a board member of Edge. He will be followed by Dr. Maren Bozic, a leading dairy economist and an advisory board member for Edge. So I turn it over now to Tim. Tim, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are here as Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative to share what we see as a path forward on milk pricing reform in the United States. This comes after more than a year of research, conversations with our members, participation in a multi-state task force, and engagement with other stakeholders. As we look to the future, we're announcing 2 key policy priorities for pricing reforms. They are centered around flexibility and fairness. Edge is focused on improving relationships between farmers and processors in a way that will increase transparency, fairness, and competition, and give farmers a reasonable amount of price certainty. This relationship must transition from strictly transactional to strategic, one that's based on a long-term view, adaptability to the markets and customers, and requirements of products. A transparent business-to-business approach will be critically important to success for our farmers and processors. We also need a system that safeguards us from doing business outside of the current federal marketing order. The bottom line is that Edge wants our farmers and processors to both be successful, and we think these priorities will support that goal. Now we'd like to turn it over to Mitch Davis for more details. Mitch?
Thanks, Tim, and hello, everyone. I'm Mitch Davis, the managing partner of Davis Family Dairies in Le Sueur, Minnesota, and I'm a member of the EDGE Co-op Board of Directors. I was honored to represent EDGE in a multi-state task force coordinated by the cooperative to study comprehensive milk pricing reform. I've tried to bring my experiences from both dairy production and dairy processing into the discussions. My family has a 3-generation, 75-year history in dairy processing, and we entered the milk production side of the business around year 2000. As such, I've been afforded views from both sides of the milk production, milk processing side of the sale of farm milk to processors. Before reviewing specifics of our priorities, I want to share 4 main points that are reflected in the proposal. First, given the wide differences in product mixes around the country, we believe more regional flexibility in federal milk marketing orders would benefit everyone. Secondly, we believe that regulations should support fair and equitable dealings between farmers and processors. A standard set of contracting principles would make the system more fair and equitable, and we believe strengthen the trust between farmers and processors. Next, we recognize that the participation in federal milk market orders cannot be assumed. We believe that these changes would be positive for both producers and processors, whether the federal orders remain in place or not. Finally, we welcome the opportunity of working with other groups to come to an agreement on priorities. The end result must be a system that fosters transparency, trust, and collaboration between farmers and processors, and a more attractive marketplace for both parties. Now I'd like to break down our priorities. As Tim mentioned earlier, they focus on 2 areas. The first is flexibility. In our proposal, each federal order would have the authority to operate its milk shed in a way that makes sense for that order. This is done to some extent already. This approach would account for geographic differences in population, farmer base, and product mix. The flexibility would help avoid unintended consequences of the current uniform price rules, such as frequent switching of pooling status, negative producer price differentials, and declining share of total milk production pooled on that order. Also, change could be achieved through the uniform benefits principle instead of currently used uniform price principles. We see this system as being designed through a collaboration of farmers and processors, and then formalized in an inclusive USDA hearing after enabling legislation is passed. The second priority area is fairness. EDGE feels there should be a standard set of contracting principles that would make the pricing system more fair and build more confidence in the system for both farmers and processors. EDGE is recommending 10 principles which would lead to contracts and supply arrangements between farmers and processors that are constructed to help processors compete and innovate, and to strengthen trust between farmers and processors. I'll touch on those 10 principles. Number 1, written contracts. We believe all milk supply agreements should be in writing. Number 2, timely payments. We think farmers should be paid in a timely manner. Every 2 weeks makes sense, and with no more than 3 weeks lag. Advance checks should be paid in accordance with what is known about the current month's pricing environment at that time. Number 3, the verification of weights, tests, and samples. Unless a farmer voluntarily opts out, third-party certified organizations should be utilized to verify milk weights, component tests, and samples. Verification organizations are also allowed to provide other services to farmers. Number 4, transparent pricing formulas. For farmers to be able to effectively manage risk and understand the financial implications of improvements they may make in farm practices, milk composition, and quality incentive programs, such as somatic cell count, protein and volume premiums, and a multitude of others. Things must be clearly spelled out in the milk supply agreements, and sufficient advance notice given before incentive formulas change. Processors should be allowed to set pricing formulas as needed to successfully compete in both domestic and overseas markets. Number 5, contract termination notice. Other than extraordinary circumstances, we believe processors must give a reasonable amount of time as to notice before contracts can be terminated. Number 6, good faith principle. Both processors and farmers should act in good faith, and disputes should be addressed through an arbitration process with meaningful penalties for unfair behavior. Number 7, equal opportunities for all farmers. No special deals should be allowed. Any incentive payment offered to one patron must be offered to all current patrons, meeting the same criteria as set by the processor, including but not limited to differences in farm location, size, and milk quality. Number 8, competitive risk management. We believe farmers should be able to effectively manage price risk using a combination of processor-specific basis contracts and private or government-supported risk management instruments. Number 9, exclusivity and volume limits. We think processors should not impose exclusivity if imposing volume limits or two-tier pricing. And number 10, equal treatment of processors. These terms should apply to all milk buyers in the United States, irrespective of their ownership structure or their participation in federal milk marketing orders. As we develop these principles, we've had conversations with some processors. We value that input and invite processors to continue working with EDGE and our farmers on constructing a collaborative policy proposal. With that said, I will hand it over to Dr. Bozic.
Thank you, Mitch. I just want to provide some added context. Federal orders are instituted to ensure that all dairy producers in a certain geographic area can participate in revenue from sales of beverage milk products. And what's the problem? The problem is that over the next 10 years, the share of U.S. milk production utilized in beverage milk products is likely to fall from 18.3% this year to 14.5% 10 years from now. And since last year, we are now exporting more milk solids than we are using domestically for beverage milk products. My estimates are that over the next decade, between 45 and 60% of all additional milk solids, skim solids, will need to be exported. So when fluid milk sales are scanned, then, and if we want to impose the uniform price rule, what does that mean in practice? That means in practice that one type of manufacturer has to subsidize another type of manufacturer. For example, powder makers must subsidize cheese makers if class 4 price is higher than class 3, or cheese makers must subsidize powder makers when class 3 is higher than class 4. Of course, they don't want to do that, so then that's what they depool. So the only way that federal orders do not become irrelevant, first to upper Midwest, but later also to other regions where most milk goes to manufacture dairy products, is if we go back to basics. If we implement the uniform benefits approach, what that would mean is no more cross-subsidization between manufacturers, no more negative PPDs. Now, details of this are probably best left for a hearing, but the hearing cannot take place unless enabling legislation allows such hearing to take place. So the core of EDGE's proposal is to provide enabling legislation so that the hearing can take place. And we need to go beyond federal orders. We need to set a new foundation for success and trust between producers and processors, as Mitch mentioned. You know, when I talk with dairy producers, I always hear saying 4 or 5 things. They want to have a fair treatment and good faith relationship with their buyer of their milk. They want to understand how the buyer of their milk is performing relative to others in terms of the milk price that they're getting paid. And by the way, they want to understand their milk check. And once they understand their milk check, they want to effectively manage price risk. So I'll finish with this. Ex-Secretary Tom Vilsack suggested that the only way forward if there is a consensus in the dairy sector. So what the Class 1 mover reform from 2018 can caution us is that we should not define consensus too narrowly. And crafting policies behind tightly closed doors and there is bad deal. Resulting reform may suffer from fragile or flawed design. We need a broad and open debate. And I applaud EDGE and its grassroots efforts to expand the dairy policy debate beyond federal orders, beyond federal order maintenance issues, and to work collaboratively with dairy processors to find common sense solutions that will set U.S. dairy sector on a trajectory for success. And now I will turn things back over to Jamie.
Thank you, Dr. Bozic. We can get to the questions now. If you would, please direct them to one of the spokespeople. Otherwise, I can try to help there. You can type your question in the chat box, click on the icon, the hand icon on the top of the window. And if you're joining by phone, I'll come around after some of the other questions are asked and make sure everyone has a chance. So any questions from anyone? We do have a question here. Question from Dave Natsky. Can all 10 priorities be achieved or implemented through the FMMO system, or will any or all require separate congressional action, including revisions to the Copper-Volstead Act? Dr. Bozic, is that for you?
I can address that one. Some of these principles are currently being implemented through federal orders. For example, timely payments for milk, verification of weights, tests, and samples. The challenge for long-term sustainability of that approach is that processors can depool. And as manufactured milk rises and fluid milk sales drop, they will more and more frequently be depooling. So that's why we believe that perhaps there is a need for a separate statute that will specifically address the relationships, provide some meaningful guardrails to the relationships between dairy processors and producers. The Copper-Volstead Act offers limited exemptions to antitrust issues to cooperatives as they market their products further. It doesn't really address how they should be operating with their members, with the producers. So that's why. So the Copper-Volstead Act looks towards the market. What this proposal looks is towards the relationship between processor and the producer. Jamie, back to you.
Thank you. Jackie has this question. Can you talk more about what work you have done with other organizations to reach consensus and begin this discussion to see if others are supportive of your proposal? Tim, I would maybe offer that to you.
Sure. Yes, we have had ongoing conversations with others in the dairy industry, and a lot of this really culminated during COVID and some of the aspects of what that did to the supply chain. We had a multi-state task force, which included South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska, along with Wisconsin. And that task force met for almost 2 years talking about big picture, how do we really move things forward? But again, and our priorities today are just kind of our goals, what we'd like to see. We believe that, through collaboration, through communication, there's a lot of things that we can accomplish. So again, I think it's just begun. Conversations always happen in dairy. I mean, anybody that's involved in dairy knows there's always conversations. But we just wanted to frame up that we really believe we need to go big picture with this if we really want to look to the future of dairy generations for the generations to come.
Joanna Guza has a question. Would the contracting principles hinder opportunities for processors and/or farmers? What are the give and takes? Mitch, is that a question that you'd like to answer?
Sure. And I think it sort of speaks to what Tim just said. There's a lot more conversation that has to take place. We need a lot of input from processors. We need to learn what impediments or challenges might lie ahead in that area of contracts. We don't understand the details of their business, and they don't understand the detail of the daily workings of ours. So I think both sides of the equation need to have a lot more conversation to understand what a productive, mutually beneficial, and equitable contracting situation would look like.
And if I may add on to that too, I think right now we're paying the price for not having those guardrails outside of the federal order. So I think we're kind of paying the price every day by not having a big picture relook at this. So we believe that even though it's going to be hard work, and collaboration is hard work, but as long as we stay focused on the future, we believe that this will definitely be a win-win for all.
Sherry Bunting, she says she's wondering if we envision the enabling legislation would be broad or would reflect consensus on some of the points Dr. Bozic, that you mentioned. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I can echo what Mitch and Tim have said previously. Today's press conference is the start of a process, not the end of a process. It marks a milestone after a year and a half of performing a very rigorous analysis within our task force here in the Upper Midwest. But now we start talking with other groups, both regionally and nationally. And the product of those collaborations, the product of those conversations will certainly be somewhat different than what we presented here today. That's the whole point of talking with someone rather than talking to someone, that you arrive at something that's better than what you have when you started. What we've seen, so there are two pieces potentially of enabling legislation that we are talking about here. The first is the enabling legislation to federal milk marketing orders, which may need to be just slightly tweaked to allow orders to be formulated differently than the uniform price principle. The other statute, the other legislation that could potentially become either something in the Farm Bill or a standalone bill, etc., is the Fairness in Contracting bill. Those kind of regulations have been done elsewhere. Australia introduced it just a few years ago, and in Australian bill, they did enumerate a set of principles that they believe are appropriate for their market. The wisdom in crafting regulation is to give it teeth, but not make it such that it's overly prescriptive and hinders rather than allows new wins for both processors and producers.
Thanks, Dr. Bozic. Philip Brasher. Phil, do you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Okay.
I wonder if he's, oh, there we go. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, a couple of questions. What does this do to the class 1 mover and the make allowance? Obviously, IDFA is pushing to get cost updates, get the make allowance changed on a updated, well, they're not specifically asking for that yet, but getting the cost updates presumably to get the make allowance changed. How does that situation change? And as I understand it, you're talking about each order kind of operating separately, and I don't know how does that factor into the issues that we've had with the agreement that was in the 2018 Farm Bill and the 74-cent differential. Maybe that's a question for Dr. Bozic. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I can address that. Let me use a metaphor. Like if you had a car, you have to change oil every 5,000 to 7,000 miles, and then you need to also replace the timing belt every 100,000 miles. Make allowances class 1 mover, that's changing oil. And we're talking about a timing belt today. Like we're talking about setting the structure for success long term. We are not envisioning that the formulas would be different order by order. What is different already order by order is how the funds are distributed once they are collected to the pool. So the skim fat order and multiple components, how do they differ? They don't use different class 1 movers. They don't use different protein prices, but what they differently incentivize producers. In the MCP orders, you pay producers for more protein. In skim fat orders, it's mostly about more fat, somatic cell counts, etc., because fluid is dominant there. So this would not make the orders tremendously different they would not be different in terms of pricing formulas. The question is, how do we structure incentives so that processors see the benefit of consistently being pooled on the orders? And those incentives must vary. You know, when you look at Southeast Florida, they have a lot of fluid. They can keep everyone pooled all the time. In the Northeast as well, they can put very stringent depulling or repooling criteria because they have a lot of fluid as a big carrot that they can offer. But in our order, that's not the case. And over the next decade, that is increasingly not going to be the case in the Mideast, Central, Pacific Northwest, etc. So it's about modifying incentives for processors to stay consistently pooled on the order, and at the same time offering producers more certainty, meaning more effectiveness when they manage risk, so that we don't have the nonsense that we had in 2020 with negative PPDs completely surprising producers out of the blue and making them feel like fools for having engaged with risk management activities.
Can you give an example of how you would incent processors not to depool or to stay in the pool?
Yeah. So in some sense, it's very simple. Processors will depool if the money leaving their pocket is bigger than the money coming to their pocket. That's what happens. Like, that's why class 4 is depooled nowadays or this year a lot. Like, if class 4 is higher than class 3, then class 4 processors have to pay more money to the pool than they take from the pool. And of course, they don't want to do that because that means subsidizing cheesemakers. So they depool. If we can organize the system in such a way that all processors meeting certain performance criteria receive more money from the pool than they pay to the pool, then they will stay consistently pooled. But in order for us to do that in a market that doesn't have a lot of fluid, we will have to modify the organizing principle from what is today called uniform price into what we're calling uniform benefit.
Okay.
Tim or Mitch, anything to add?
No, I would just add that, obviously we've been out front with the class 3 plus proposal. We're still working on, as Maren talked about, changing the oil. Definitely, we're looking at all those moving parts that will be important to the structure of the components of the federal order, but we're looking more at the regional structure. But we're not losing our sight on the other topics that will be of interest of everyone.
Thanks, Tim. Anyone on the phone have a question? Then I'll come back to a couple of the others that are in the chat box. Anyone on the phone with a question? Okay. Dave Natsky has another question. Will congressional action be necessary on some provisions before an FMMO hearing could address others?
Jamie, I can address that one. I think that a lot of issues that are currently being worked on by multiple groups, including National Milk and IDFA, can be addressed before enabling legislation is modified. Make allowances, class 1 mover, standard component tests. Those are the issues that can be addressed within the current legislative framework that we have. But some other changes, the ones that we talked about here today, uniform benefits, they will require enabling legislation. So we could potentially have the first round of hearing on changing the oil and then the second round of hearing on changing the timing belt, to stay with that metaphor.
And I would maybe add, seems to me it'd be more productive to have more of the global discussion than to do the piecemeal things we've done in the past, because history shows it's a long process and it doesn't address all of the items that need to be addressed. So it would be, I think, advisable to have a more comprehensive discussion. And if that means enabling legislation is necessary, I think that's much more attractive to the industry long term.
Dr. Bozic, this is a follow-up to the previous question you had about, or answer you had about the mover. Where does that incentive money come from if class 1 is not always higher, since class 1 is the only class required to pool?
From class 1 differentials, from class 1 location differentials. So it can be done. We will follow up with a white paper that will provide some more mathematics, if you will, or details to this. We've stayed away from excessive level of detail on this press conference, not because we wouldn't know how to do them, but because we are introducing now the 10,000 feet, big picture, and then we'll go from there. And also, we believe it would be counterproductive if anybody would just latch on one particular detail, because all those details really should be worked through collaboratively with processors and other producers, within the industry.
Do we have other questions? I see one is coming in on the chat box. Anyone on the phone? All right, we'll wait just a minute here. We have a couple. So Jackie Fotka from Farm Progress asks, Dr. Bozic, you testified on Capitol Hill last week. Do you think there's an appetite and financial resources to make changes? And what did you hear from congressional members?
Well, thank you for your question. In the remarks after the hearing, Chairman Scott indicated that the focus of the committee should be expanded to address competition as one of the issues. And fairness in contracting does address that. Also, fairness in contracting requires political will, but does not require billions or even hundreds or maybe even tens of millions of dollars for implementing it. Perhaps something for administering and oversight, but we are not talking about, this is not a subsidy program. This is not a Title I program like their margin coverage. So it should not impinge on baseline from that perspective. We will see. Beyond that, my guess is as good as anybody's. Certainly, I am very proud of the leadership that the Edge is providing in this field, and this is truly a grassroots efforts, and I'm grateful to be able to serve their needs in an advisory capacity.
Question from Dave Natsky. Is the future of FMMO at stake?
I think the present of FMMO is at stake as well. If you look at the share of U.S. milk production that is pooled, that is trending down fairly consistently, depending on which class is higher than the other, but no producer can have certainty anymore in majority of orders that their processor will remain consistently pooled, and therefore they don't know, they don't have certainty on how should they most effectively manage risk. PPD today is what for May in order 30 was 13 cents positive. There are still some milk checks out there with 72 cents negative PPDs. How does that make sense? Like, we're not talking just about future federal orders. We're talking about present day situation and starting today but with an eye on the future, with creating a win-win that will serve us for years to come rather than fighting past battles.
I'd add to that. I think that question was sort of answered in 2020 when we saw in the summer months massive depooling, and yet negative $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 PPDs assigned to milk checks. Now, it may be the PPD box on the check was utilized to get the price to market conditions, but in a producer's mind, that really disturbed the confidence in the federal milk marketing order system when your milk isn't pooled, but you're getting a negative PPD of a high magnitude.
Sherry Bunting has a follow-up question. We referenced the timing belt, so to speak, being worked on. So in the short term, should make allowances be tied to evaluation of the Class 1 mover?
I think that's a political question, not an economic one. So I don't know that I'm any more qualified to answer it than anybody else.
I would just echo what I said earlier. I think it's time, high time, for a comprehensive discussion on milk pricing reform, and taking buckets of it in a vacuum that suits certain parties' needs at the time would be short-sighted.
Another question here in the chat box. Does EDGE oppose an FMMO hearing that just addresses the mover. And maybe that's somewhat been addressed here.
I think we just have to see how the conversation evolves. I mean, everything's going to depend on the current condition at that time. We're monitoring all options to make, like I say, changing the oil now or looking at the timing belt. So I think it'd be presumptuous of us to say what the scenario might look like. I think we'll know a lot more in the months to come as this conversation continues. But Edge has its size on all the balls in the air, and there's many of them. But again, our members are depending on us to move this forward in a very positive way.
Any other questions from anyone? I'm not seeing any. So we'll wrap up then. Thank you all for participating. We truly appreciate your interest. Reminder that a recording of this press conference will be available to you hopefully shortly, and I'll send you all a link. I just see one last question that's popped into the box. I'm going to jump back. How would you describe the current state of discussions with National Milk and IDFA, and who else would be involved?
Well, currently there've been informal conversations. Obviously, we go to all the trade association meetings. We have informal conversations. I think everybody's still in their corners figuring out what their platform's going to look like. And as I understand, you have to check with Jim Mulhern, but I believe they're not. And I believe IDFA is in the same boat. They're not quite there yet, but we're connecting with them as frequent as possible. And again, we're looking for a very collaborative and transparent process.
Tim, if I can also add, I'm not sure that the field should be just confined to National Milk, IDFA, and Edge. What about the American Farm Bureau Federation? There are other groups representing producers in different parts of the country, groups that are typically not very involved because their part of the country does not have federal order. But if we are talking about milk pricing reform that goes beyond federal orders, perhaps they should be consulted as well. So, there is a big field, and again, open and broad debate may sound messy, may be messy, but it's really the right way to go forward in an inclusive way.
Great. Thank you for that last question. Again, we'll have a recording of this press conference out to you all shortly. And Mr. Trotter, Mr. Davis, and Dr. Bozic will be available for individual interviews. Just contact me and we can arrange those. In the meantime, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll connect you with the best source. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.